Alright, let's take a look at injection. There's lots of different kinds of injection. Probably the most well known is something called SQL injection, which allows us to inject code into SQL statements for acting on databases, but there's also other forms of injection, LDAP injection, XPath injection, lots of different kinds of injection. So let's take a look at a couple here. We've got a couple of injection issues on this site. Typically where one goes, first of all, for injection is actually the login. The login does have an injection issue, it's just not a SQL injection issue. So we want to start with SQL injection. So on the home page, if I pick one of these books and click on it and get more details, see it says up here ID equals 2 in this case. So it is probably, I would guess, picking books out of the database and filling out this information based on what's in the database. So what I want to do is, my first thing I check when trying to do SQL injection is just put a single quotation mark, a single quote at the end. So this should cause the SQL syntax to break if it is vulnerable to SQL injection. If they're using SQL correctly, this should be filtered out. Any of my special characters should be filtered out, so it will still pull up 2 and filter that out somehow, or pull up nothing, possibly, depending on how it filters. But if it is vulnerable to SQL injection and accepts that single quote, then it should break the SQL syntax and it should throw an error. Sure enough, I get an error, unclosed quotation mark after the character string. So I even get some code, so it says on my SQL adapter it has what my SQL statement is. Select star from bookmaster where book ID equals plus book ID mycon, so my connection string. So it wants the book ID, which in this case was 2, but then I broke it with semicolon, or not semicolon, single quote. So based on that, we should be able to create a valid SQL statement. So what if we do, just playing with the errors, we can do like 2 where it equals 2 or 1 in select DB name. We can just tell based on this code that this is going to be MS SQL, so we need to talk MS SQL. So depending on what kind of database you get, you might have to change your syntax. This dash at the end, that's like comment for SQL, so everything after this, so all this mycon, etc. is going to be gotten rid of, so we closed here the colons. Or the, not colons. What are those things called? Parentheses. There we go. This is still going to throw an error, but it should give us data in the error. So conversion failed when converting the in varchar value book app to data type int. So the DB name is book app. And it looks like it has a table called bookmaster. We could do, what if we put in 2 or 1 equals 1? So even though we put in 2, we actually ended up with book ID 1 because we put in 2 or 1 equals 1 and then commented out the rest. So the first thing that's going to come up there, basically 1 equals 1 is always true. So 2 or true. So the first thing in the database list that comes up is 2 or true is going to be the first entry. So we ended up with the first entry, which is not as interesting here because we just got another book. But when we get to the XPath injection for the login, that will be pretty interesting. So 1 equals 1 is always one I go for because it'll just make everything true. and can make things rather nice for us. So we saw an example of being able to get data out, an example of manipulating what it gives us. So another tool I like to use for SQL injection, because in order to do SQL injection well, you have to know SQL. So there's a ton of things you can do with the SQL injection, but like I said, you have to be pretty proficient at your SQL commands to do it, because that's what you're doing. I like to use a tool called SQL Map to help me with my lack of skill. And my SQL, I do -u and give it the URL I want, and we need to give it an injection point, which is bookdetail.aspx, and ID equals something. We could set it as 1, but ID equals 2, and we have a lot of different options, so you can read the help pages on this, but --dump, dumps database. Oops, I didn't close my quotation marks. There we go. So what this is going to do is it's going to take the injection point that we give it, try it for SQL injection, and if it works, it'll do whatever we ask it to. Could be Microsoft SQL Server. Do you want to skip test payload specific to other databases? Yes. Yes, that's fine. Now it finds out that the ID parameter is indeed injectable. I'll just say no, that's the only parameter there is anyways. So since I told it this is a dump, it actually will dump out the entire database, which, since this is just books, again, it's not particularly interesting. But it's an example of what we can do. If it was a user database and they weren't using solid encryption, or even if they were, we saw in the password section that we have some options there. As long as they're not using good salting, we still may be able to get some stuff out fairly easily. We have some other options besides dump as well, like one we might like is os-shell, which, as the name implies, is it's actually going to use the database to try and get a shell on the underlying system. So we got a couple shells on our Windows 7 system already, but we could certainly use more, and MS SQL generally runs as a really privileged user, so could save us the trouble of going through those post-exploitation steps if it's already running a system. So it says that XP_command shell procedure does not seem to be available. So that on newer versions of MS SQL is true because, well, people were using it maliciously like we are, just opening up a command shell, so it is off by default on newer versions of MS SQL. That said, you may be able to re-enable it. In the default configuration, you can just turn it back on. So I'll say yes, I do want to re-enable it. Sure, why not? Alright, so we got our shell. Cool. So, how about who am I? Yes, I want to retrieve the output. I'm system, so, you know, at that point, net users. Not many local users, but I swear there were more than that. That's odd. So net groups. I know you've seen all this already. Domain, admins, domain, Well, I guess since, I don't know. I don't know why that's not working as much as I would like. But we could always do like IP config, of course. And there's our IP address information. So, I mean, we saw all this in the post-exploitation section, but we do have system level access to this. So that's cool. So SQL injection is one that's pretty big. If you're not developing correctly in terms of security, you can have issues like this. I've done it myself, you know, it's just like I need to get this web front end working right now because I have to present the tool like tomorrow and I'll fix it later kind of thing, and can end up with SQL injection issues like this. So it does still happen. Hopefully your application developers are doing a better job now. It is pretty well known about security issues in web applications. That said, easy issues like this happen all the time in applications, so there's no rule that says you can't have issues in your app. Alright, so let's take a look at login. I mentioned this is actually using XML authentication, so it's going to be a little bit different, but the logistics are the same. So I get my user input fields, and I'm just going to put single quotes in both of them. Click go. I get my error. User at name and password has an invalid token. So here's how it's setting it up. How nice that it gives us the source code, right? So string credential, username, and password. So it is using XML, so it's XPath, but we should be able to attack it in the same way. So if I do my single quote, wait, let's go forward. So it looks like we have 3 quotations here. So in the username, it looks like it has a quote on either side since it's a string. Like, since the other one was an integer, there were no single quotes around it, but these being strings, they do have quotations around it. So we're ending up with 3 quotations for username and password. So that's how we're creating the error. So we are going to want to leave our quotes in. So I want quote to finish or 1 equals 1. And I'm going to want single quotes around these, because it is strings. So 1 with single quotes around it equals 1 with 1 quote around it, and then that extra one will come from the actual login. So we can do the same in password, or 1 equals 1, go. I'm logged in. I'm logged in as a user named Mike. I don't know what Mike's password is, no clue. But I imagine Mike is the first entry in that XML, in this case, list of users. So it said nothing. So username is blank and password is blank, or 1 equals 1, that's true. So the first time there is a username and password, which should be the first user, that's the one we get logged in as. So no password required. Pretty cool, huh? Because now we're that user. We could possibly see information about them, or even if they store credit cards, buy things on their behalf. Pretty cool. So that's just a little bit about injection. Again, there's certainly much more practice to be had on each of these. I mean, web is huge. Everybody does web now, so it's certainly an area to spend your time. No route to host, that's nice. So I'll fix that before I do the next video, because I'm not sure why I suddenly don't have connection between my 2 VMs, but I got my stuff done for this video at least.